Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's America Walks webinar, Walking, Biking, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, what you and your community needs to know. We'll give folks a minute to join the webinar, and then we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Let's get started on today's America Walks webinar. First, I'd like to thank our webinar's facilitator and America Walks board member who's joining us today. That's Abdullahi Abdullah. He's a council member in New Brighton, Minnesota. And I'd like to thank as well our partners. We're particularly grateful to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and their program, Active People, Healthy Nation, that's sponsored this material you'll be hearing about today, including the Larger Intersections Initiative. So a bit of housekeeping. If you have questions today, and we welcome many questions, we encourage you to put them in the Q&A box that you see at the bottom of your screen. That's the easiest way for our panelists to track your questions and keep them handy for the end of our presentations. We have ample time for questions today, so please don't hesitate to ask away. The webinar is also going to be recorded and uploaded onto our YouTube channel later on. So we have three panelists joining us today from each of the respective partners of the Intersections Initiative. We have Mike McGann, Executive Director of America Walks. From the Safe Routes Partnership, we have Marisa Jones, Policy and Partnerships Director there. And then we have Ken McLeod, Policy Director for the League of American Bicyclists. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to our panelists, starting with Mike to kick us off today. And Mike, you're on mute.
Hi, I'm Mike McGann. I'm the Executive Director of America Walks. I'm really excited to do this webinar, and in particular have a public launch of this partnership with the League of American Bicyclists and the Safe Routes Partnership. As you know, as we all know in this field, the federal bipartisan infrastructure law provided an extremely large amount of money for transportation infrastructure. And lots of that money goes to the states where they will spend it in what's called flexible funding or formula funding. But there are specific discretionary grant programs and other funding sources in the infrastructure law, which are, focused on active transportation. And our organizations, so the CDC has funded this work by our three organizations, the League of American Bicyclists, the Safe Routes Partnership, and America Walks, to support local communities that are working to tap into that funding. So we have a website, which is an entry point for people that are interested, that has some basic information and also how to reach us, intersectionsinitiative.org, and that should show up in your chat, and you'll see a slide for that as well. And each of our organizations, we have, somewhat different skill sets and experiences, but we all have this shared belief in the power of community to improve their own communities through investments in active transportation. So again, we're really excited about the partnership, the support from the Centers for Disease Control and Active People, Healthy Nation. In fact, go Google Active People, Healthy Nation, sign up for them as well, get information about them. Because the power of investing in active transportation and activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations just has tremendous positive effects for health, for safety, for community resilience and well-being, for quality of life, for equity. And and local economies. So again, we want to express that our excitement about this program. So we're going to turn it over to Marisa first, and then Ken, to kind of work through a couple of the entry points to the that infrastructure funding. But if there's one thing you can take away from this introduction to everything, is that this is a long-term effort. This federal infrastructure funds are going to be around for a number of years. People are entering this discussion from various levels of sophistication, and our organizations are here to work together to support your local efforts, because we want to see a lot of demand for these types of projects in communities, and demand that we hope will go far beyond the amounts of funds in these specific granting programs. So with that, I'll turn that over to Marisa.
Thanks so much, Mike. And thanks so much, America Walks, for having us. Let's see. I am so excited to be here today to talk to you about the Transportation Alternatives Program. So this is funding that is available for walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school, among other things. And it goes to every single state, and there is funding available for communities of all sizes. So I imagine that many of you on this call today are people like a woman that I spoke to this morning in Georgia, who's an ordinary person who cares a lot about bicycling and wanted to understand what funding is available, and learning that every state gets money from the federal government that can be used for walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school was a really welcome thing to share with her. So I want to make sure that everyone here on this call knows about this funding, knows what it can be used for, and understands what steps to take to prepare to apply for and access those funds. I've been introduced, but Marisa Jones, I'm the policy director at Safe Routes Partnership. I live in the city of Philadelphia. And Safe Routes Partnership, if you're not familiar with us, we are a national nonprofit organization that works to make it easier, safer, and more equitable for kids and people of all ages, abilities, and disabilities to walk, bike, wheel to and from school and throughout their communities. So let's talk about the funding program that I want to highlight, which is called Transportation Alternatives. It is the #1 source of federal funding for walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school. Every single state gets this funding and can compete it out to local communities for projects like sidewalks, crosswalks, bike lanes, safe routes to school, education and encouragement programming, trails, and more. And one of the things that's really unique about this program is that it's designed to support local priorities. So Mike talked about this in his opening, that a lot of the federal funding gets programmed at the state level. So the funding comes from the federal government, goes to states, and states decide what to do with that. Transportation Alternatives is a little different because it gives local cities, counties, local school districts, nonprofits the ability to apply for the projects that we at the local level know will make it easier, safer, and more convenient to walk and bike in our communities. So that's one of the reasons that we want to highlight this for folks like you who are attending this, because it's one of the few federal funding opportunities that local communities can say like, hey, this is the project that we are interested in. It gets awarded by state departments of transportation and metropolitan planning organizations through a competitive process. And typically, 80% of the cost is reimbursed by the federal government, and a 20% local match is required, but there is some flexibility. And there are a lot of new flexibilities, and we're so excited to see states getting really creative on some of the new provisions in the infrastructure law. So what types of projects can this fund? I've talked a lot about like sidewalks, crosswalks, pedestrian infrastructure. It can fund both the engineering infrastructure associated with safe routes to school, as well as the non-infrastructure, the education, the encouragement, And then there are a number of other eligibilities in here too, like environmental mitigation and other community improvement activities, provided that they have a transportation nexus. As I mentioned, this program is unique because of who is eligible to apply. So I put a list here. So local governments, transit agencies, public land agencies, tribal governments, and small MPOs, metropolitan planning organizations for the areas under 200,000 can apply, nonprofits can apply, and other local and regional agencies that administer transportation or trails. I love before and after pictures, and so I was trying to find some nice representative photos of projects across the country that have been created through Transportation Alternatives Program funds, and I put the links below to where I got the photos from if you want to learn more about the project. This is in Durango, Colorado, some nice sidewalk improvements. This is in Wilmington, Delaware. You can see the pedestrian streetscaping. And here are some examples from Corvallis, Montana, with street crossings. And again, the links are here. You can learn more about the project. So I talked a little bit about how the funding gets from the federal government to local communities. And it follows a formula that about 41% of it gets competed out by the state for communities of all sizes. And then 59% of that gets competed out based on community size. And so again, another really unique aspect of this program is that there's money specifically for communities under 5,000 people. Small communities have money specifically eligible that they are eligible to compete for, that communities that are larger than that are not eligible to compete for. And then there's a pot of money for smaller towns, say 5,000 to 50,000. Then a little bit bigger, 50,000 to 200,000. And then the major metropolitan areas with over 200,000, they compete in competitions run by their metropolitan planning organizations. And so one of the things I really just want to impress upon you is that every state gets this. Every state gets this, and there's this funding available for communities of all sizes. So we often recommend to bicycle and pedestrian advocates, safe routes to school, interested districts or parents or PTAs, local governments that are trying to think about how do we start making it easier and safer for our community to walk and bike. We often suggest that you start with the Transportation Alternatives Program. And why is that? So one of the reasons is that you don't have to do as much of the heavy lifting of making the case for why to invest in walking, biking, and safe routes to school. Those are some of the main things that this program is intended to fund. Again, it can fund other things too, but the vast majority of the funds go to walking, biking, and safe routes to school. So it's nice because you don't have to justify that those things matter and that you want to apply for them. And that there's significant money every single year. So since the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, over $1.3 billion has been allocated to the state. And that number is going up each year through 2026. And this program has been around since 2012. So there's significant money every year that is intended to, among other things, support walking, bicycling, and safe routes to school. Every single state gets this. And as I showed in this slide, there's funding available for communities of all sizes. So this is a really, really unique program. Historically, when we look at the applications compared to what gets funded in transportation alternatives, historically, the national average has been that about half of applications to this program get funded. But the great news is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law increased funding for transportation alternatives by 60 to 70% over 5 years. So there's never been more funding for this program. We highly, highly encourage you to start here if you are interested in supporting walking and biking and safe routes to school in your community. So let's talk about some of the steps to apply and some of the tools and resources that are available to help you be successful. First stop is your State Department of Transportation's Transportation Alternatives website. There you can find information about when the next competition is and learn more about their application process. In partnership with the League of American Bicyclists and through this Intersections Initiative, we developed these state-specific fact sheets for every single state in the District of Columbia, where we lay out how much money your state has available to compete out, which MPOs, which metropolitan planning organizations get money, how much money. When we're able to find it, we put when the next TAP competition date is and who the point of contact is. And the League has graciously hosted all of these fact sheets and a table showing the competition dates on their data website. And so we have a link directly here. Go look for your state-specific information. That's your first step. The next step, once you're on that website, is figuring out what makes an application competitive in your state. So federal law sets out certain things about this program, like that division of how the funds go to communities. That is set by federal law, and there are a number of other things. But there's a lot that federal law leaves up to states to interpret and implement the way that they see fit, and then with flexibility for their state. So each state runs this program a little bit differently. Most states have a PDF on their website that tells you about what makes an application competitive. Here's what you need to do. Here's what you need to submit. So we highly encourage you to go in and look for that to figure out what's going to make a project competitive. What if I know 10 things that I would like improved in my community, which one has the best chance of getting funded? And so here's a screenshot. I think this is from Georgia. Some states require pre-work, many do. So in some states, you might see that their application really highly scores projects that demonstrate public involvement. And so if you're looking at this, you see, oh, the application opens in September, it's now March. We would get a lot of points if we show that the public supports this, like putting some of the wheels in motion to demonstrate public involvement. So I put some of the other things on here too. Some states require a resolution of support from local government. That's another one that maybe this is the time that you work to establish those relationships with city council members, with your mayor, sharing, hey, we're interested in this. Other steps that you might need to do, some states require that you complete a local public agency sponsor training, check that out. TAP applications typically include both like a written narrative. So tell the story. Why will this help kids get to a local park, as well as improve ADA compliance for seniors to access meals at the rec center? But then there are also technical components like cost estimation. So with that, if your community has a planner or an engineer on staff, they may be able to complete that, but you might also need to engage outside professional assistance and look at like engineering or consulting firms for that. But I also want to flag that a new flexibility in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law gives states the flexibility to use some funding to help get projects in the pipeline and then expedite the delivery of those projects. This is new, so not all states have this up and running yet. Many do, and we have been so delighted with the innovations that we've seen coming out of state departments of transportation. But this is something that you can reach out to your state DOT and ask for help. We have a number of resources available to you. Here's the full screenshot of that flow chart that I shared. We have a ton of information on our website. I referenced those state by state transportation alternatives program fact sheets. On a quarterly basis, we track how states are doing implementing this. And as Mike shared, we are so delighted about the opportunity to partner with America Walks and with the League of American Bicyclists to help local communities apply for and access this once in a generation investment in transportation. Reach out to us. Here's the Intersections Initiative Gmail address. And we would be happy to connect with you and answer your questions. And with that, I am so delighted to pass it over to my colleague at the League of American Bicyclists, Ken McLeod.
Thank you for that great presentation, Marisa. And I am excited to talk to all of you about the League and the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant program, which is a new grant program created by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So for a little bit of background about me, I'm Ken McLeod. I'm the policy director for the League of American Bicyclists. You can find me on Twitter at KenMCLD, and my email is on that slide, ken@bikeleague.org. Love to talk to all of you. The League has been around since 1880. We started out advocating for paved roads, and we're still advocating for safer roads today. Our mission is to lead the movement to create a bicycle-friendly America for everyone, and that's made us really focus on equity over the last few years. We have some recent reports about equity and reconnecting to the new majority, and also a great report about benchmarking bike networks and making sure that bike networks reach everywhere in our communities and serve the people who aren't just biking today, but might bike in the future. Our signature program is the Bicycle Friendly America program, which gives awards to universities, communities, and businesses. We really encourage communities to apply for recognition through this program. And every community that applies gets feedback on what they can do to make biking better in their community. It's a free application, so if you aren't sure where to start on your journey to a bicycle-friendly community, please engage with our program, and we are happy to provide you assistance. And Marisa already talked a little bit about data.bikeleague.org, but this is really a continuation of a benchmarking project that has been around since 2007. There's a lot of data on the site, over 140 tables, charts, and graphs. We have those fact sheets on the Transportation Alternatives Program. We have fact sheets that give key stats and figures for all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and 75 other cities. So there's a lot to dig into there if you aren't sure about where to kind of orient yourself, or if you want to benchmark your community against other communities or your state against other states. And if your community isn't one of those 75 cities and the District of Columbia that are part of our data set, I'd be happy to help you find similar data for your community. So getting to the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant program. This is a brand new program from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and it is a program that focuses on significantly reducing traffic deaths and serious injuries. It is $5 billion over 5 years. And a really important part of that is that 40% of that funding goes towards planning. So if you don't have a plan, this is a great way to start your planning and get yourself oriented towards making your streets safer for all people. There is an emphasis on people biking and walking and using scooters and other mobility devices, but this is for all people, whether they are driving a car or occupants of a car as well. Similarly to transportation alternatives, the organizations who receive these grants are local governments. This is a grant program directly from US DOT, so there's no state intermediary for these cities and counties and townships that are receiving grants. And you can see that most of the funding is going directly to city, county, township governments. So it is great to have collaboration. There are some great resources that FHWA has done to talk about multi-jurisdictional grants, where you have a nearby city and a nearby county joining together to go after this grant funding. But it is really at that local level where you should be working with your city, your county, your township, maybe a regional organization or a metropolitan planning organization. Those are the people who can apply for this funding and are likely to get this funding. There are really two types of grants, but kind of three types of grants for the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant program. The first type is the action plan. So that is for a community that currently does not have a plan to reduce traffic deaths. This is getting you started, getting you on that journey to reduce traffic deaths, kind of setting out how you will approach the problem of traffic deaths in your community. From there, there is supplemental planning that is available. Once you have established your approach to reducing traffic deaths. You can get supplemental planning grants to do some of the activities that move specific actions developed in that plan forward, or update processes or other things that will move that plan into implementation. And then finally, there are implementation grants, which is permanent infrastructure that is deployed based on an existing plan to significantly reduce traffic deaths. And in the first year of the program, we can kind of see how that funding has borne itself out. 800 million was awarded, so not quite the 1 billion. And most of that went to urban areas, but there was 160 million that went to rural areas as well. And most of those grants were smaller action plan grants to get communities started. Most of the money went to implementation grants. You can see that, you know, if we need 40% of that funding to go to planning, we need to get most of that money into implementation grants, is that nearly 600 million. So we need to get those planning grants out there so that we can also get that implementation funding. And then interestingly, the supplemental planning was the second highest amount of funding. If you look into those plans, you can see that action plans tend to be smaller. There were a lot of action plans that communities got that were in the $400,000 to $500,000 range, where the local community was getting 80% of that funding from the federal government and 20% from their local community for that match. So there were a lot of similarly sized local grants like that. The smallest was just over $6,000 up in McGann, Alaska, a town of 200 people. So don't be discouraged if you are a smaller community. You are absolutely competitive for these action planning grants and supplemental planning grants. The supplemental planning, the 80-20 split that you see a lot in the action plans was a little more skewed to having greater local values. I think some of that is that those are planning activities related to ongoing local programs, such as repaving, that already have a budget. And so you're looking to change what's happening in that ongoing program. And there's a greater local budget participation there. And then the implementation grants got closer to that 80-20 split and tended to be larger. So that again is for permanent infrastructure projects. So some key steps to think about is just asking your question where you are in the process. I would encourage everyone, if you're unsure about it, go for an action plan grant. Make sure you have a really solid base in a comprehensive safety action plan. Make sure that you are rallying your local leadership to support safer streets. And then from there, think about supplemental planning activities that you can do once you have an action plan. Is there a specific place in your community that you know has a traffic safety problem but is difficult to solve, and you could use a planning grant there that is going to be 80% paid by the federal government? Or is there a process that you aren't sure how to approach, whether that's repaving or integrating with your transit system, pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure, where planning can really help there? And then those implementation grants are probably going to be the most competitive. And so I would encourage communities to approach that in terms of thinking about the underserved communities that have been highlighted by the administration and their Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of federal funds will be used in disadvantaged communities. And also many of the funded implementation grants used and referenced FHWA's proven safety countermeasures as a way to show that they were improving traffic safety using those proven safety countermeasures. So those are two keys that I would look for if I was going after one of those implementation grants, which I think is going to be more competitive. So I'd make sure you're going planning first, second, third, and then if you're feeling really good, go for that implementation. Here are just some examples. I was lucky enough to be involved in my local Safe Streets and Roads for All grant application in the city of Roanoke. But you can kind of see creating that comprehensive plan, getting things going, and then adding kind of discrete planning activities as they did in Kirkwood, Missouri, And then when you get to an implementation grant, that is specific permanent infrastructure. And according to FHWA, more than 90% of those grants improve pedestrian safety, more than 80% improve bicycle safety. So some keys, in my opinion, about what makes a successful application is aligning with the safe system approach. If you're unaware of it, it is from the US DOT's National Roadway Safety Strategy, and it is used widely internationally. There are 5 objectives that US DOT has articulated, and there are shifts from traditional traffic safety to this safe system approach that they have articulated. Could go on about it for hours, but I'm going to try not to dwell on it. Collaboration and leadership, making sure that you are involving every important stakeholder in your community and addressing them in your planning activities, I think is very important. Again, planning, those planning dollars are there for all of you at 80% federal funding and can really kickstart activities. When you look at the implementation grants, having an identified high energy network that the project is going to address seems to be a key. And then that Justice 40 and environmental justice alignment, where those projects are more likely to happen in a census tract with a disadvantaged community. Those are kind of keys to having a successful application there. Just one last pitch from me for planning. You know, use this planning funding to set up your pipeline of projects moving forward. So that those could be transportation alternatives projects, as Marisa discussed, so that you have, you know, a 5, 10, 15-year, 20-year pipeline of projects that you can compete for in the transportation alternatives program. It could be making sure that you have a data-driven safety approach to identify projects for your highway safety improvement program, which is a state-administered federal funding source. And it could just be for places where there are state or local funding sources that will pay for projects but won't pay for plans. This is a great opportunity to do planning for safety improvements and set yourself up for state and local funding down the road. And then for processes, you know, making sure your repaving is doing work to create your bicycle pedestrian network, implementing things like tactical urbanism and other engagement, and then making sure your bicycle and pedestrian plans are up to date and have best practices. If they don't address protected bike lanes right now, update them. Use this 80% federal funding to update your bike plan, make sure it has protected bike lanes. And finally, just making sure in the long view that every project is a safety project. Bicycle and pedestrian facilities are eligible for 90% of federal funding programs. They just aren't used by all of the federal funding programs. So with really good planning, you can set yourself up so that you're competing in every single federal funding program and making it a safety project in the future. And thanks, and I think I hand it back to Mike.
Yes, that's right. Those were great presentations from both Marisa and Ken. And Ken, you can jump into the Q&A tab if there are any questions you can knock off there directly. Marisa's knocking them off one at a time. So those were really detailed presentations, and a little bit more on my background to kind of tee up what I hope will be a quick presentation. I got involved in transportation advocacy, just trying to get sidewalks in my neighborhood in Seattle. It was a portion of town built without sidewalks. And that engagement, plus lots of other environmental and community engagement, ended up leading me to running for mayor. We know our audience is at different places in the spectrum of transportation advocacy. So I'm going to offer a couple of insights from that. Boy, where do you even start when you begin advocacy and want to get in this thing? And maybe some insights about the politics of transportation spending that might be helpful to you as you're thinking about how to proceed and kind of get to the point where you can get funding. So let me share my screen. And here is, here we go. This is the, that's the street for my local sidewalk project. And that's what it looks like now. I added the before and after because Marisa had some great ones. It was a lot of work. It took a lot of effort to try to find federal funding to just build, find local funding to build something like this, and really informed it. Really the first thing I would say, if you're getting started in this arena, projects are really the basic unit of funding. You need a project to get funding in some way or another. And a project has a defined scope, it has a defined budget, and your starting point should be, does your community already have projects? If what you want to do is tap into the funding, what are the planning that's been done in the community? What's been going on? Is there some gap analysis? Is there a pedestrian master plan? Is there a bike master plan? Is there a street improvement? So if you're an advocate and you want to know, want to see if your community should be getting more funding, really that's your first question to start asking of agencies and elected officials. What's been planned already? You may find that there are not yet projects. So in that case, it's time for a plan. And Ken and Marisa both pointed out both of these funding sources that they're talking about fund planning. And that's a great place to start. And plans can take a lot of different forms. So, you'll want to use that planning process to start building the broad community support, agency and elected official buy-in to get where you want to go. And after all those words, this is just a picture to breathe easily of, look what can be done in a street with good planning, and when you get a defined project that then can be funded. So here's just some political observation that I've made. I kind of wish I'd learned some of this before I became mayor. I learned some hard lessons as mayor about this. If you want to get something done in local government, as between elected officials, agency officials, and the public, you need 2 out of 3, really, in order to get something done. So I'd offer that to you as an analytical starting point when you're looking at your own community. And you might be, if you're in the audience, you're one of these, and you should be able to take a look around and start asking yourselves, where are the other 2 areas, if my portion of this wants it? So if you're an advocate, where are the elected officials? Where are agency officials? None of these are monolithic, by the way. Elected officials disagree, the public disagrees, there are divisions within agencies, but you need a weight behind each one of them. So as you're starting to build public support, start making that analysis of where is the weight of support for active transportation projects in your community. Now, obviously, I know why I put this slide in. This is the 2 out of 3 example. You notice how they don't put big highway projects to public votes much anymore? These are pretty much done, my opinion, with the support of agency officials and elected officials. An example of how 2 out of 3 can get where you want to go. If you have all 3, you're off to the races, you're ready to go. Now you just got to start sorting out what exactly you're going to apply for, how much money, what is it going to be for, if you have that level of support from all 3 sectors. If you have 2 out of 3, now you've got to start, you have to identify what you want, you need to start working on the 3rd, and we can help with that. The objections from the 3rd party might be from an elected official saying, well, has anybody else done this? Will this really work? Is this technically feasible? We have lots of examples of probably places where these projects have been very well received. It might be an agency official who believes that something isn't eligible for funding, or it's too difficult to go for funding, and we can work on that. And clearly, sometimes it's the public that needs to be brought along. And we're certainly willing to provide information we have that might help bring the public along. So yeah, work to get the 3rd sector on board if you're thinking about moving ahead. And if you have 1 out of 3, well, don't despair. But now it's time for coalition building. And this is where you've just got to start going out and build that broad coalition of support. I just want to point out to everybody, this infrastructure bill is in place for years. So there'll be a round of funding now, there'll be another after, Projects take time and persistence. and a lot of work to get that alignment between government officials, elected officials, agency officials, and the public. So the earlier you can start, the better. And I'll just start with the last before and after. This project took years and years in my neighborhood, but that play structure for McDonald's, and a McDonald's was replaced with an internal street by the developer here, which supports housing and more local small businesses. This was a years of projects, but you can make a difference in your community. Even if you're not a professional or an elected official, this was all work that was just done in our community, pushing the government and the local property owners to make a more walkable community. So with that, I will stop sharing, and we will ask everyone to come back and let Abdullahi start asking questions.
Thank you, everybody. I am Abdullahi Abdullah, City Council member in New Brighton, Minnesota, and I'm also Transportation Equity Coordinator at Minnesota Department of Transportation and one of the board members here at America Walks. There are plenty of questions. I'll just get right to those. Starting with there were some questions about, are there any thoughts that you have on what makes a successful application, especially for safer streets for all? So we'll just start with that.
Yeah, based on what I see in the first year of data, if you're going for an action plan, if you're a community that currently doesn't have a comprehensive safety action plan, you are very likely to be successful in getting a planning grant. If you were going for that supplemental planning, you're going to need to be more specific and really make sure that you have alignment with your current comprehensive safety action plan, and show why your approach makes sense for supplemental planning dollars. And then that implementation grant program is going to be the most competitive. There's going to be projects that have tried for other federal grant programs, most likely being repackaged for that program. So really look to addressing a higher injury network corridor in a disadvantaged census tract with proven safety countermeasures from FHWA seem to be things that showed up in a lot of successful grants there.
Thank you, Ken. And then Marisa, one quick question that I would like you to tackle is, can you do any planning with transportation alternatives funds? That multiple people ask that question.
Yeah, I did see that question come in a lot. So planning is a legally allowable activity for transportation alternatives. That being said, as I mentioned in my presentation, every state gets to decide what they want to prioritize or not prioritize. So we do see some states say like, sorry, no planning grants. On the flip side, we have some states that say, here we're setting aside some of our transportation alternatives program funds specifically for planning. And I will also say that since the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and this huge influx of funds, we have seen states that previously did not allow planning to be an allowable activity are now allowing it. So I'm just going to go back to my look at what your state says, but from a legal perspective, it is permissible. You just have to check what your state allows. Thank you,
Marisa, for that. And then I will go one more time to Ken before I go back to Mike. Mike's there, you're unmuted. Is there a quick thought that you have there?
No, keep going, keep going.
Okay. Sounds good. Ken, I believe this is for you on safe streets and roads for all. Is it possible to use existing plans to check all the planning boxes to qualify for Safe Streets for All implementation grant, or is it necessary to get a Safe Streets for All planning grant first to follow the compliant plan? That has also been asked multiple times. And also, how does this interact with existing Vision Zero plans?
Yeah, so it's 100% possible to check the planning boxes with existing plans. This was the first year of funding that they just announced last month. Second year announcement, notice of funding opportunities should come out next month and will run until September, most likely. So the $590 million of projects that got implementation grants this year were based on existing plans. And those were likely Vision Zero plans, communities that were part of the Vision Zero network or had other comprehensive safety action plans that maybe didn't even say Vision Zero, but checked the boxes. All of those implementation grants that happened this year were based on existing plans, not plans through this program.
Thank you for that, Ken. There's one question that I should probably have started, which is, when are we expecting future runs of application stopping? This is very general. Mike, or
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
the question is, when are we expecting future rounds of applications to open?
When are the next future rounds? I'll actually defer to Marisa and Ken. I think they're a little more on top of that than me.
Yeah, I'm happy to share. So transportation alternatives, every state runs that. And the link that we dropped in the chat and shared that's on data.bike league, we are tracking every state upcoming TAP competition deadline. So keep an eye on that. And then some states like Minnesota, they put it out there for the next 5 years. Here's our schedule for the next 5 years. Way to go, Minnesota DOT. And then in terms of the federal discretionary grants, we have been operating on trying to compare when they came out last year to estimate when they'll be coming out again in the future. So for example, RAISE, which is one of the programs that we didn't highlight, like that just closed. It came out last fall or winter. So we expect that next fall or winter, that's when that would be coming out. Safe Streets for Reconnecting Communities came out sometime in the late spring, early summer. I think we would expect that too. We encourage you to look at the US DOT website, and on grants.gov, you can also sign up for the forecasts of when these notice of funding opportunities are coming available. I know there were also questions about some of the other programs, things that got funded as part of the budget, the omnibus. And we just really want to recognize that US DOT has been standing up a whole bunch of new programs under the infrastructure law. They have not yet got into the programs that were funded under the omnibus. So there's even more coming. But taking a look at the US DOT Navigator is going to be your best bet for staying on top of when those discretionary grants are going to be coming out.
That's really great. Thank you. And there was a related question that I saw come that was for folks that are still new and might be coming from or serving smaller communities. How do they find out information about, especially contact information about, like, who is even in charge? Is it the state DOT or the NPO that will be administering those grants? Like, where do they start? How do they get that information? Anyone can as well.
Ken, you guys have, I recall that you have a spreadsheet on all of this, and it's on our Intersections Initiative website of all the different funding sources. Is that right?
Yeah, years ago, we did do a spreadsheet of all the different funding sources, and FHWA, I think, now maintains that and has that. And bicycle and pedestrian facilities eligible for 90% of federal funding programs, even if they aren't used all the time by all of those programs.
That's great.
I kind of want to jump in here because it's really illustrating. I mean, these are the types, well, it's illustrating a broader point here, which is there are so many different potential funding sources for good projects. It was part of the reason why I wanted to just hit that idea of that really your starting point on a lot of this is projects. If you've got a good project with broad public support in your community, and by broad support, from the agencies, from the elected officials, you got champions in the city council and mayor's office. You got folks in the agency that want to make it happen. You have the public saying, yeah, this is an important change in our community. Once you have that, there's lots of places you can start shopping around for money, and including your own, local budgets and or state budget funding sources of flexible funds. Grants aren't the only place, but grant opportunities are a great place to start building that momentum, because it is money specifically for that purpose. and that your community can compete for. But once you get a good project list and start packaging it together, you can really start working with that. And when I use the phrase packaging it together, start taking a look. If a project is too small, sometimes it can lose. Sometimes packaging things together can create greater traction. So for example, in the state of Washington, this is far larger than any city or town would do. They looked at all the gaps in their active transportation network on their state highway system. Well, now they've got a large collection of small projects, and that's something you can build support around. So if you're in a town, if you can identify multiple small things that add up to a larger thing, like a basic pedestrian network or a basic bike network for your community, that can actually that can build more support and get more champions to kind of compete for all the funding sources. So I realize that isn't as technical as some of the questions people are asking, but putting it to getting your local act together and building that support around a really good defined project goes a long way.
Can I jump in with one other thing here?
Yeah, go
Sorry.
ahead.
I just want to add, so for whoever's asking, like, oh, where do we start? Who do we go to? Like, you're doing the right thing by being here on this webinar. I want to make just a couple of other pitches here. So one, as Christopher Dowis from the Federal Highway Administration put in the chat, very helpful, US DOT launched a navigator, excuse me, recognizing that like it is overwhelming to know like all these different programs and what can you apply for. You can check out the US DOT Navigator. We'll make sure there's another link in the chat. Then I also want to make a pitch for the Friendly Intersections Initiative, Safe Routes Partnership, America Walks, League of American Bicyclists. We know these programs really well. We can hear what your local interests are and help you pair up like, okay, what might, I'm so sorry. What might your community be most competitive for? I mean, I've had very, very small towns say like, okay, we want to apply for X. And it's like, that's awesome, but that's going to be a stretch. Why don't we start with this one that's way more accessible? So we can help you, like definitely go to the US DOT Navigator, but we are also like human navigators that can help you. And we're really grateful to this funding from the Centers for Disease Control that enables us to provide that type of support. So I know our friends at America Walks have more info on that, but we're here to help you with that too.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm gonna really affirm that. I mean, that is why we've launched the website, is because it is indeed can be overwhelming, and sometimes having a guide through the woods is a lot easier than reading the guidebook. So absolutely feel free to reach out to us, and the website, the intersections-initiative.org website, I feel like I'm on an infomercial now, has a form where you can fill stuff out and ask questions, and it'll land in a inbox monitored by all of our different organizations. We will do our best to field all inquiries and respond. So the questions you're asking in the chat here today, or that you may think of tomorrow, there's another way to come back to us again. This is the start of a project for us, not the not one-off.
That's a really great resource. There are a ton of questions, but so I'm glad there is a resource out there for folks to keep asking these questions. And maybe there's a way to answer the questions that we didn't answer in the chat or some other form. This one question that always comes up, and I know has not been answered so far. I think, can somebody talk about Justice 40 initiative and the intersection it has with Safe Streets for All? I believe that's you, Ken. If I don't want to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I can try to answer that.
Yeah.
So the Justice 40 initiative is an initiative by the Biden administration to make sure that 40% of federal funds from certain programs are spent in disadvantaged communities. So they have created several kind of mapping tools to identify those communities. And there were certain census tracts identified as part of the Safe Streets and Roads for All grant program as disadvantaged communities. They have a really cool visualization website called Our Nation's Roadway Safety Crisis that kind of drills down into that and can show disadvantaged census tracts throughout the nation and where traffic fatalities have occurred in those disadvantaged census tracts. And Justice 40 just says that the administration has a goal that 40% of funds from certain programs like Safe Streets and Roads for All are used in those disadvantaged census tracts. You know, there's more to it, and there's ongoing kind of discussion about how those census tracts can be refined and better targeted. But that's the basic premise, is that disadvantaged communities deserve investment, and it's a positive goal of the administration to make sure that 40% of funding from certain programs is invested there.
Thank you. And there's also a related question that has been asked under the TA grant. And that was, how can we shift, or what can we do to shift funding to equity so that, you know, most impacted communities can benefit from that? Especially this person was commenting on how we continue to see more affluent communities that are getting access to these funds rather than historically disinvested communities and low-income communities of color. Specifically in New Mexico, that where this person is writing from, but that is general trend across the state. So Marisa, do you have some thoughts on that?
I couldn't come off mute fast enough. I'm so happy you asked this. So one of the things that we're so excited about in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is that there's a new provision that requires states to define and prioritize high need communities when selecting and prioritizing transportation alternatives projects. So that doesn't apply to all the money, but we love that this is a first start. So I'm going to drop a link into the chat where we have our organization. I don't know how to do this. I will share it somewhere, but we have a fact sheet where we track how every single state DOT is already which state DOTs are already doing that. And we will be updating that as more and more states comply with that. And I'm really glad that somebody from New Mexico asked this, because before the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, New Mexico was not asking questions that looked at equity. And now, as part of their transportation alternatives project selection, they are using what they're calling a composite equity score map that, based on how a community ranks, influences the prioritization of that project in TAP project selection. So I will make sure that everyone gets the link to this fact sheet, and your state is now required to define and prioritize high need communities. If they're not doing that, you might want to have a conversation with your DOT in a friendly way about how they might consider doing that.
I just want to also just jump in I see people in the chat talking about a barrage of information. There are all these links in the chat. You've all seen the slides. I just want to assure everyone, one, this webinar is recorded and will be posted to YouTube. Two, we do a follow-up blog post with all the links and slides. And if you registered, you will receive an email with links to the recording and links to the blog post. So all the information you're seeing will be here. Will be made available. Give us a few days. It takes generally 3 to 5 days to pull it all together and send it out. So do not despair that the chat is the only opportunity to catch up with all of the information being shared. We'll follow up.
That's great. And having 2 minutes left, I just want to give that to Ken and Marisa for any other parting words before we wrap up.
I saw a few questions about sidewalks and sidewalks on private property and things like that. I think great questions. It's way too often sidewalks are thought of as private property or the responsibility of private property owners. A planning grant from Safe Streets and Roads for All could address how a city might transition from a system where sidewalks are private property responsibility to a public responsibility. That's the type of thing that you could plan around and kind of move that forward. So I would suggest that as one thing. And just as everyone else has said, please reach out to us through the Intersections Initiative if you want more information.
My parting words are that for so long, we have been told that there's not money for walking and biking and safe routes to school. Since the passage, there has been, it might have been a lack of political will, but since the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, that's no longer going to cut the mustard. So there's the money available. We encourage you to either apply on behalf of your community if you are an eligible entity, or encourage your local decision makers to apply. Echoing my colleagues, reach out to us. We want to help you be successful to access these funds.
Do we have, Kate or Ben, do we have some closing slides? I'd be happy to take
Yes.
us to the finish line at this
I'll
point.
leave us out. Thank you all.
Ah, there we go. Here's the link to the all new interactive website. Look, they even have a QR code, but if you, again, you'll have an opportunity to get a follow-up from us as well. I really want to thank Ken and Marisa and the League of American Bikes, the Safe Routes Partnership. Definitely want to thank the Centers for Disease Control. You know, we did not talk, and we could talk at length about the real equity considerations in this. One of our real goals is to try to level the playing field so that communities that have historically been under-resourced and have not had the same opportunities to apply for funding. If you are one of those communities, or if you're a member of a community organization that wants to see your community better, reach out to us. We want more people in this game, and we want to address the inequities in funding. You know it, you can look around, you can see that that Black and brown neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods oftentimes have wide, unsafe roads, do not have adequate walking and biking, and facilities don't have good bus stops and transit access, and better off communities do. And there's the money available to try to start making a difference in that. So if you want to, if your community deserves more, we believe that too. We want to help you with that. Please reach out to us. We want to make that a priority in this work, as does the Centers for Disease Control. And I also want to echo what Marisa said about we've often been told there's no money. There was money. It's just a question of priorities. And there's even more money if we can get the public demand for this. So I'm just extraordinarily grateful to the turnout for this, the people that are engaged, the people that are doing the work in their own communities to make this happen. Be on the lookout for our next webinar. We're going to talk about Safer Fleets Challenge, how government fleets can use something called intelligent speed assistance to reduce speeding in government vehicles as an example for reducing speeding across the board. We're really excited about this, and join us in that. And I also want to say Safe Routes Partnership, the League of American Bicyclists, and us all rely not just on generous grantors, but on the support of individuals. So if you're appreciative of the work we are all doing together, you can find a way to support us so that we can keep doing this. This is right in the strike zone of what all our organizations want to do. And the better resource we are, the more of this we will do. Because this honestly, this is what we're here for, is to build much better communities for all. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again for the work you do in your community.